The October Revolution is one of the most important events of the last century, which fundamentally changed the entire course of world history. A new political system never seen before was established on 1/6 of the world's landmass. In essence, an unprecedented social experiment began on the territory of the former Russian Empire, the consequences of which the world is still dealing with today. The creators of the October Revolution wanted to build the world's first state without rich or poor, without one person exploiting another. Interesting plans, but as we know, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and this is exactly one of those cases. As a result, the revolutionary upheavals and subsequent turmoil led to enormous human losses, the exact number of which is still unknown, and yet things could have turned out differently. The October Revolution was by no means inevitable. Moreover, it was the result of a combination of circumstances that could very well not have come together. What would have happened if the Bolshevik coup had not taken place or had failed? What would the former territories of the Russian Empire have looked like in that case? What path would the history of the last century have taken? I will try to answer these and other questions in this episode. My name is Semyon and I'm launching the What If series. Let's begin. A successful coup or a great revolution? For 70 years, communist propaganda told the people that the revolution in 1917 would have happened no matter what, and that the Bolsheviks inevitably took power. But that's, to put it mildly, an exaggeration. At the beginning of the last century, even the revolutionaries themselves didn't really believe their ideas could be realized in Russia. From the perspective of classical Marxism, a proletarian revolution was supposed to happen in Western Europe, but definitely not in backward agrarian Russia, where there was one small problem: there simply weren't enough proletarians. Marxists have always considered the working class the main driving force of the revolution, and they had good reasons for that. Compared to the peasantry, workers were less conservative and almost universally literate. They were easily influenced by socialist propaganda. Due to their concentration at factories, it was not difficult to organize them for actions against capitalist oppressors. In the Russian Empire, there were only 2 million workers, whereas, for example, in Germany, they made up about 20% of the population. Therefore, Marxists believed that there was almost no chance for a revolution in Russia. Lenin himself, the ideological leader of the Bolsheviks and the main inspiration behind the October coup, said in January 1917, "We old men may not live to see the decisive battles." And just a month later, the February Revolution broke out and the monarchy was overthrown. So even the smartest and most perceptive Lenin did not see the real prerequisites for a socialist revolution, literally on the eve of historic events. On the other hand, by the beginning of the last century, so many contradictions and problems had accumulated in the Russian state and society that they simply had to end in some kind of social explosion. The existing state of affairs did not satisfy anyone at all. The peasants wanted a solution to the land issue, the workers wanted better working conditions, and the intelligentsia wanted democratization according to the European model. Even Russia's big business was dissatisfied that it was not allowed to participate in political processes. It was obvious to everyone that autocracy had outlived itself, and the country needed urgent and radical reforms. There was another serious problem: the ruler's inadequacy. He simply did not live up to his position. Under normal conditions, the Russian state apparatus still functioned, albeit poorly, but in a crisis, it quickly spun out of control. This was clearly demonstrated by the war with Japan, which ended with the First Russian Revolution. At that time, they managed to keep the situation under control and suppress the unrest, but no conclusions were drawn. No one ever drew any lessons from what had happened. In 1914, Russia got involved in a world war it didn't need, and that's when all the problems of the Russian state came to the surface. Defeats on the battlefield and huge losses caused enormous discontent in society, which eventually led to the February Revolution and the collapse of the centuries-old monarchy. And now we come to the key part of my story. to the event that preceded the Bolshevik coup, which the communists later pompously called the Great October Revolution. After the Tsar's abdication, power passed to the democratic provisional government led by Kerensky, a socialist revolutionary. It's hard to call his policy anything other than suicidal. On one hand, the provisional government insisted on continuing the war, which was extremely unpopular among the people and the army. On the other hand, it openly flirted with the Nefei.
С левыми радикалами.
It wasn't just Kerensky, but also the leftists, who were responsible for the attempted armed coup, which was suppressed by troops loyal to the government. But even after that, Kerensky did not carry out harsh repressions as the military demanded, limiting himself to only a few. In the early years, the seizure of power was only a matter of time. By November 7th, Bolshevik forces controlled almost all of Petrograd. The provisional government had only the Winter Palace left, which was completely blocked by the Red Guards. On the night of November 8th it was taken, and the members of the government were arrested. Thus, the first attempt to create a democratic state in Russia failed. Could the Bolshevik coup have been avoided? Yes, and quite easily. To do this, it was simply necessary to listen to the generals, who, after the July coup, demanded that the Bolshevik party be banned and its leadership hanged, which was absolutely logical in wartime conditions. However, Kerensky believed that the new government should act in a civilized manner. He constantly repeated that he could not trample down and drown in blood the fragile sprouts of young Russian democracy. It was from these very sprouts that the most terrible hysteria grew, and the harsh dictatorship of the 20th century. The provisional government itself should not have engaged in empty talk, but should have carried out the necessary reforms, or at least proposed them to society. None of this was done. As a result, in just a few months, the popularity of the first Russian democratic government plummeted into the abyss. If it had continued to enjoy popular support, the Bolsheviks would hardly have dared to attempt an armed coup. Russia without the October Revolution.
Переворот. Россия без Октябрьской революции.
We've figured out the course of events and their main causes. Now let's try to imagine a Russia in which the October Revolution never happened at all. The main result of such a scenario would be the cancellation of that social experiment which lasted for more than 70 years on 1/6 of the Earth's landmass. Perhaps the attempt to build the first socialist state is important for world history, but for the peoples who were occupied by the Russian Empire, it brought only grief and suffering. You can't conduct such experiments on people. After all, they're not guinea pigs. It's hard to say what upheavals would have awaited Russia without the Bolshevik Revolution, but there definitely wouldn't have been the horrors of collectivization and Stalin's Gulag, which means millions of people would have stayed alive. It can be said with confidence that Russia, together with its Entente allies, would have become a victor in World War I, and the conflict itself would most likely have ended sooner. After all, it was the revolution and the actual withdrawal of the Russian army from the war that allowed Germany to transfer significant reserves to the Western Front. It's hard to say whether Russia would have received Constantinople and the Black Sea Straits, its main geopolitical prize in World War I. After all, it's no secret that France and England were not at all enthusiastic about such a prospect. Most likely, the resolution of the issue depended on the internal political situation in Russia itself. In any case, with or without Constantinople, Russia would have been spared such a shameful page of history as the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Regarding the situation inside the country, everything depended on who would be in power, liberals like Kerensky or strongmen like Kornilov. In the second case, it would hardly have gone without tightening the screws, and in the harshest sense, with censorship, arrests, dispersal of demonstrations, and possibly even executions. Russia went through something similar during the suppression of the 1905 revolution, but even so, it would not have compared in any way to the brutal 70-year dictatorship that the country found itself under after the Bolsheviks' victory. An alternative Russia would hardly have avoided civil conflicts. There were just too many tensions had built up in society. The situation was extremely complicated. The peasants demanded land, the workers wanted bread, the army desired peace, and the government had to promise its foreign partners that it would continue the war. There were dozens of different political parties operating in the country, many of which were quite radical. Society was extremely agitated. In the big cities, rallies were held almost every day for all sorts of reasons. There was no unity even among the political forces that came to power thanks to the February Revolution. But even in the case of some conflicts within the new government, Russia would have managed to avoid the bloody horrors of the civil war that happened in real history. There would not have been mass immigration of millions, epidemics, and complete devastation of the national economy. Let me remind you that the Russian Empire was doing fairly well during the First World War, at least compared to the other participants. There was no famine in the country as there was, for example, in Germany. Not even a ration card system was introduced. In the future, Russia would most likely have developed like a typical European country. It would have become a republic with a permanent parliament, numerous parties, and developed self-government. Perhaps in the 1920s or 1930s, Russia would have had to go through a period of dictatorship. Almost every European country had similar chapters at that time. Now about the borders. It's no secret that in real history, the First World War became the true graveyard of European empires. Not only the Russian Empire collapsed, but also the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires. And Germany lost its overseas colonies. The February Revolution led to a rapid growth of national consciousness among the peoples of the Russian Empire, who had long been under occupation and used for the benefit of the Tsar. Ukrainians, Belarusians, Georgians, Finns, Lithuanians, and many others wanted to create their own states. No one wanted to be exploited. But the Bolsheviks used force of arms to bring them back under Moscow's rule. Some managed to break free from the brotherly embrace. For example, the Poles, Finns, and the Baltic peoples. But some were not able to do so. Even if the October Revolution had not happened, Russia would hardly have remained within its borders. But it's hard to say how great the losses would have been. It would all have depended on the new government and its determination to use military force against national movements. If a liberal government had come to power in Petrograd, many peoples would have had a chance to create their own state. Perhaps in 2 or 3 decades, a confederation of peoples similar to today's European Union would have emerged across the former Russian Empire. But if the security forces had taken over, everyone who wanted independence would have been harshly forced back into line, which would inevitably have led to a series of bloody conflicts. A world without the October Revolution. The victory of the October Revolution had a huge impact on many countries around the world, where they decided to repeat the Soviet experiment in one form or another. And almost everywhere, these attempts led to sad results. Almost always, they resulted in poverty, repression, and utterly foolish self-isolation. You can find examples even today. Look at Cuba and North Korea. But these are just pathetic echoes. In the middle of the last century, there were dozens of countries that chose the Soviet path of development. Without the October Revolution, even the political map of the world itself would look different today. For example, without massive Soviet support, Mao Zedong would hardly have been able to conquer and unite China. Soviet ideas would not have appeared in Cuba, in Vietnam, or in many countries of Africa. There wouldn't have been a bloody war on the Korean peninsula, and all Koreans would be living in one country today. The experience of Soviet communists inspired their colleagues in Cambodia, Ethiopia, and China to commit mass killings. Without the Petrograd Cheka, those countries likely wouldn't have experienced such atrocities. Some Western historians believe that without Lenin, there never would have been Hitler. There is some truth to this, because many in the West saw the Nazi dictator as a counterbalance to the communist threat in Europe and supported the Nazis. Although revanchist sentiments in defeated Germany would have arisen anyway, perhaps not in such a schizophrenic form. If it weren't for the Soviet Union, there wouldn't have been a Cold War, at least not in the extremely harsh form we all know, with the real threat of nuclear war. Without scientific and technological rivalry between the two superpowers, progress likely would have been much slower than in real history. Perhaps only now would we be marveling at the first computers in action, and space travel would still seem like a novelty to us. I mainly emphasize the negative aspects when discussing the October Revolution and its aftermath. Well, I really do consider this event a true catastrophe on a planetary scale, which crushed millions of human lives. There's also an important positive aspect that shouldn't be overlooked. The October Revolution took place under the banner of the struggle for justice, which people of the 19th and early 20th centuries so desperately lacked. The horrifying reality of that time simply demanded action. The events that took place in the Russian Empire greatly frightened the Western elites, forcing them to reconsider many things. But in the West, it was all done without going to such extremes as war communism or dekulakization. Throughout the entire 20th century, socialist elements were gradually integrated into the familiar capitalist system. In conclusion, revolutions never happen spontaneously. They occur when those in power drive the situation to complete disaster. And usually they do this stubbornly over a long period of time. However, revolutions themselves are often similar to the most destructive natural disasters, like hurricanes and earthquakes. After them, nothing but ruins remain, and everything has to be rebuilt from scratch. Well, that's all for now. See you in the next episode. Bye.